Welcome everybody to our first Islington Reads of 2023. And I was doing a little last night when I was sort of prepping for today. I looked back and I realized we had our first Islington Reads meeting back in July of 2020. So we're going on 2.5 years of having Islington Reads. And for those of you that are joining for the first time, Islington Reads is a community book club and is a partnership between Islington United Church and a Novel Spot bookshop. And it is a book club that's well open to all ages, genders, and identities. And certainly since we started back in July of 2020, our numbers have grown, and it's been absolutely fabulous that we've been able to connect with so many people in and around the community and farther afield. And certainly Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting is certainly a book about communities. So anyway, I am beyond thrilled that we have Clare with us today, zooming in all the way from the UK. But first, I'd like to say thank you to Clare for joining us. And also I want to thank Penguin Random House Canada, and particularly Clare's publicist, Emma, for sort of coordinating this whole thing. So without Penguin Random House Canada and without Emma, we wouldn't have Clare here with us today. So I just wanted to shout out to Clare's publicist in Toronto with regards to connecting us all here today. So before we get into all the Q&A, as Maya was starting to say, we are going to we've disconnected the chat. Everybody was who had questions were asked to pre-submit them, and we've got lots of them. And I'm sure we probably will run out of time before we get to them all. But if we do, we will open up the chat for any other further questions that come. And again, at the very end of the event, after Clare has finished, there's going to be our breakout groups if anybody wishes to stay on and participate in those. So welcome again, everybody, to our first Islington Reads of 2023. Now, a little bit of the background on Clare. Clare was born, raised, educated, and still lives in the UK. She is the daughter of a diplomat. She was educated at a boarding school, and she studied economics at Cambridge University. So she graduated in 1991 from Newham College, which was an all-women's college at Cambridge. From there, she spent about 20 years. From there, she spent about 20 years working in advertising. And then in 2015, she started a blog called Mummy Was a Secret Drinker. And this is actually where, and I'm sure Clare may tell us a little bit about this, but this is where her writing started on this anonymous blog. And then in 2017, she got a book published called The Sober Diaries, which is her memoir. And from there, it has morphed into writing fiction. And we're certainly thrilled that Iona and Clare mixed. I'm very delighted that Clare was able to take a writing course that introduced all the characters into the that she wrote in the Authenticity Project, which was published in 2017 and then 2019. And then, of course, we all know Iona and Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting, which is Clare's newest book and hopefully not her last book. So anyway, we will get into all sorts of discussions about Iona and the cast of characters and the community she belongs to. But before we go on, we're just going to turn the floor over to Clare for a few minutes, and she's going to talk a little bit about whatever she wants to tell us about. And then, like I said, we will delve into all the questions that have been submitted for this wonderful afternoon. So I will turn it over to you, Clare, for a few minutes, and then I'll meet you back for the Q&A. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to say how delighted I am to be here, and I'm just so thrilled that you've embraced my book so warmly, and I'm really grateful to you all for reading it and for being so enthusiastic about Iona. And I thought what might make sense is for me to tell you how the whole idea of the Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting came about, and then you can ask me whatever questions you like. So so I started writing Iona during the pandemic, and so it was 2020, and we were all sort of stuck in our individual little houses, and we were. Oh, hang on! I think somebody's got a noise in the background.
Find her. I can't find her.
I'm trying to find people
on here. Anyway, it's a current book, and they bring them in, and they have, and because it's Islington Reads, they've got, the
Hold on just a
100
second.
people on there or
Brian, are
something,
you
and it's
muted?
free.
Because
Doesn't
I'm
cost
trying to
anything.
find everybody.
And it's you could.
We used to do a couple of times. Once we did it, I think, on our own. Once we did it through the book club, where you went to the library and they brought in an author to talk about.
I think the host can
same idea.
mute everybody.
I'm trying
Same
to do
idea,
that.
just that
Hold
it's on
on.
Zoom. And it's for about an hour, and then you can chat with the author.
Sorry,
Claire, you'll have to
I quite
unmute
enjoy it.
just a second.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to.
No,
catch you
it
at
just,
a bad time.
it's okay. It just started anyways. And also,
So Claire, if you unmute yourself, everybody will be now muted forever.
There we go.
So you
Hooray.
apologize.
Okay, so I started writing the book when we were in the middle of the pandemic, and we were all stuck in our little houses, and I was trying to work at home when I had 3 kids homeschooling. My husband was working at home as well. It was sort of complete chaos, and I missed all my friends, and I missed my family, who I wasn't, the more extended family. But I also realized that I miss strangers. I miss being surrounded by sort of crowds of people. And, I started thinking back to the days when I used to commute into work every day, and I used to take buses and trains and the London Underground. And I would see the same people over and over again, but I never spoke to them, because the first rule of commuting in London is that you never speak to strangers on the train, because, that's seen as being really, really weird. You don't even make eye contact. So I didn't speak to any of these people. And I started thinking, when I was stuck in my house during the pandemic, what would have happened if I had spoken to some of those people on my commute? What stories might that have led to? And that really was the inspiration for Iona and the book. And it was such a joy for me being able to spend my days in my imagination in a city that was operating normally, where people were all crowded together in a train compartment, sort of breathing the same air and sort of not wearing masks and all that sort of thing. So it was a very joyful book for me to write. It was funny, I when I started it, I remember thinking, okay, so if people don't talk to each other on public transport, what would have to happen in order to get this group of people talking? And I remembered one day when I was taking the London Underground to work, and I was sitting on the tube, and this guy was sitting opposite me, and he was dressed really smartly in a suit, and he was obviously going to a job in the city or something, and he was probably a banker. And he looked really ill, and his face had gone green, and he started going, and I thought, oh my goodness, he's going to throw up. And everybody was staring at this guy as he sort of looked more and more queasy. And eventually he picked up his briefcase, put it on his knee, opened it up, and he vomited into his briefcase, just all over the, and then he closed the briefcase again, stood up and walked off the tube at the next stop, and nobody said a word. And I thought, well, if nobody is going to talk when somebody vomits into their briefcase on the tube, then what would it take? And I figured that it would take somebody to nearly die to get Londoners to chat to each other on public transport. And that was where the first chapter of the book came from, where Piers chokes on a grape and nearly dies. So that was the inspiration really for the book and the first chapter. Well, so I'm happy to talk about anything anybody would like to chat about. If you just give me a shout.
Super. So like I said, there's a lot of these questions have been pre-submitted, and if we get through them, then we'll open up the floor to more questions in the chat. But basically, you give life advice throughout the whole book. And where do you get that common sense from, I guess? Because on page 3, literally right at the very beginning, you say most endings turned out to be beginnings in disguise. And that is really powerful. Do you actually, do you yourself believe that?
Oh, yes, I do, absolutely. And that, and actually, you mentioned in the intro that I started writing when I quit drinking. So back in 2015, I realized that I had a sort of chronic addiction to alcohol, and I was going to have to stop drinking altogether. And I honestly thought that my life was over. I thought that, my life so much revolved around being the party girl and, drinking and, and going out to restaurants and parties and bars and all that sort of stuff. And I thought that without alcohol, my life was, was finished. And actually, I now realize that that was this whole start of, a complete reinvention, if you like. And that was my magnificent second act, which is another expression that I use in the book. So that ending was absolutely a beginning, and and I see that with people all the time. Times when we think that something has come to a terrible end is often the time when something else begins, if you let it. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the big themes in the book is about ageism, and I'm really interested in the idea that women particularly are, I think, undervalued by society when they get to a certain age, and I think we have so much to offer. I published my first novel when I was 50. And, I believe that sort of women sort of in their 50s, 60s and beyond, have so much to offer. So, and what I think is really interesting is that life advice I couldn't have given people when I was in my 30s or my 40s even. I think that as you get older, you just sort of, you accumulate life wisdom, just from having been through it all. So I'm not sure I could have written this book, or indeed any book, when I was much younger. I think it is partly down to my age.
Fabulous. Yes. So now, are you the Iona in the Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting, or is there someone else in your life that you sort of have modeled Iona off of?
Oh, I wish I were Iona. I mean, Iona, actually, she's not modeled on any one person. She's an amalgamation of fantastic traits and people I've met over the years, I guess, or people that I admire from a distance. But Iona is really the woman that I wish I was. I think she's, for me, I'm really, really fond of her. Of all the characters I've written, she's probably the one that I'm most fond of, because as I was saying, earlier when we were chatting before the beginning, I think she's just really, I love the way she is so unafraid of other people's opinions. She's very much herself. She's completely unique and individual, and she doesn't mind, she doesn't care what people think of her. But I also love the fact that she's very kind and she's very vulnerable. So I'm incredibly fond of her, but she isn't me, and she isn't really anybody I know. And it's funny when you create characters, it's you sort of create them layer by layer. So you have a rough idea of what they're like, and then you think, oh, well, actually they would live in this sort of place and they would like this sort of food, and gradually over time they become richer and richer in your imagination. And it's funny, people have asked me, why did you decide that Iona, why did you create a main character who is a lesbian? And I didn't do that deliberately. I was sort of, I created this rough character in my head of Iona, and then I remember trying to work out who she was married to, and I went through all these pictures in my head of what Iona's husband would look like, and I pictured her saying, no, he's not quite right, no, he's not quite right. And I went, and I spent weeks doing this, trying to picture this man, and eventually I realized that he wasn't a man at all, and that's why it wasn't working. And it was Iona that chose that that. It wasn't me. So that's a rather long-winded answer to your question.
Well, no, it's a great answer. It's amazing. You know, I've talked to a number of authors, and all of them say these, the characters in books, when the author's writing them like you are, they take on a life of their own. And I find that absolutely fascinating. I mean, you know, I read the books, I don't think about writers taking on, like characters taking on the writing, you know, like overtaking an author and how they want to be written. But that's just another story that shows that it absolutely happens. So characters find their own voice.
I find often it feels like at the beginning when you're writing, it feels like you're putting characters onto a stage and you're feeding them lines. And after a while, if everything is going well, and it doesn't always work like this, but if everything is going well, those characters on the stage start improvising and they start doing things that you weren't expecting them to do. And that's when the magic really happens, is when they become so real to you that they start telling you where the story is going rather than vice versa.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Now, names and nicknames and invented backstories are definitely a part of this book. I mean, we've got Iona, who is the crazy dog woman. She's called the Rainbow Lady. She's also called the Magic Handbag Lady. And then you've got Pierce, which is Grape Guy, No Seat Stealer, all these other nicknames that you have in there. Why? I mean, do you feel names are extremely important? And I know when I was doing my research, Iona and Ivor, I know Ivor is the name of your best friend's husband, and Iona is the child of your best friends and Ivor. But I guess the importance of names running through the book, whether they're nicknames, whether they're actual names or imagined names. I mean, why do you feel names are so important for people?
Oh, interesting question. It's funny, isn't it? Because I really believe in nominative determinism. I think often, you give somebody a name that feels right for them. And then once they have that name, often that name affects who they become. And, I really find this with characters. I find that I create a character and then I try and find the right name for them. And then once I've attached a name to them, it actually starts influencing the character back. And sometimes when a character's not really working, you can change their name and it will completely transform the way that character works, if you like. So I guess an example is Piers in the book, who wasn't born Piers at all. His name was Kevin, and and when he wanted to reinvent himself and create a whole new life for himself, he changed his name. So I have a lot of fun with people's names, and the nickname thing I really enjoyed because I love the way that I love playing with the difference between the way we think people are and who they are really. And the great thing about commuters is that each of us will invent a story for the people we see on our commute, but we'll all have different ideas as to who that person is. So I love the fact that everybody noticed Iona, but they all had a different nickname for her, which said as much about them as it did about her. It was the things that they picked up on which were different. So yeah, I love playing with that.
Now, the title for Canada and the US was Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting, but I believe that the title in the UK was something to do with Platform 5, was where obviously the train comes into Platform 5 every morning. Did you have any say in the change of the name, or would you have liked the title to be the same? Like Iona Iverson is such a powerful name for you personally, as much as it is for the storyline. Was there a reason why it got named differently in the two countries?
Oh, one of the things I found most surprising when I published my first novel is when I realized that the author has very little control over the titles or the covers of their novels, so and there's a really good reason for that, which is, as an author, you get so close to your story that you're not actually the best person to sell it to somebody else, because you almost sort of know it too well, you're too embroiled in it, and it takes a professional to be able to look at it from the outside and say, actually, in this market, this title and this cover is going to put the story across best, so I absolutely trust my publishers to know what what will work, best in their markets. And in this instance, my UK editor and my US editor just couldn't agree which title to run with. So we went, I wrote about 50 titles. We went round and round and round the houses, and eventually they got to a point where the UK really, really wanted one title and the US really, really wanted another. And we just ended up going with both. I mean, I would prefer it if it was the same one, but just because it makes my life a little bit more complicated, because I quite often get people saying, I've been trying to buy, in the UK, they'll say, I've been trying to buy Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting and I can't find it. And it's like, well, that's the book you've actually already read, but it's in the UK, it's called The People on Platform 5. So it is quite sort of, it makes things a little bit complicated. But I think the main reason for it, for the difference, is that in the UK, they felt that the most important thing about the story was the community, so the group of people, hence the people on Platform 5. Whereas in the US and Canada, the feeling was that the Iona Iverson character was the linchpin. So they wanted a title that focused more on Iona. And, I don't know which of those is right. I think quite possibly they're both right for the different markets.
There you go. Fantastic. Very interesting. So thank you. Now, of all the characters, which character was the hardest one for you to write?
Oh, gosh, that's interesting. People have asked me that question a lot about the Authenticity Project, and I have a very easy answer on the with that book, which is the character actually who was the least flawed, is the one I found most difficult to write. For Iona Iverson, I guess in a way it was Martha, because she was born into a very different world from the one that I was born into. So it was quite important to me to make sure that that I wrote realistically the life of a teenager today. So I didn't live in a time when I was that age. I didn't have social media. I didn't have a mobile phone. So trying to put myself in that place was fairly tricky. I'm lucky in that I've got 3 teenagers myself, so I use them to check that I got all the details right. So she's probably the one that was furthest away from my experience, if you like.
Okay, and was there a character that you empathized with most at all when you were writing them? Was one that really sort of you had a lot more empathy for than others?
Definitely Iona, and that's partly because one of the main reasons I wanted to write her character was because I wanted to write about ageism. And I spent a long time in working in advertising, and when I was 30, I was the youngest woman on the board. In fact, I was one of the only women on the board, and by the time I was 40, I was one of the oldest women in the office. And I used to look around and I think, where do all the older women go? And there were a few older men, not that many, but there were a few, but there were hardly any women over the age of 40. And I left not long after that, because I just felt that I felt really undervalued, and I felt like people were treating me like I was a dinosaur when I was only 40 years old, which is sort of, which is an extraordinary situation. And for that reason, I really empathize with Iona. So those scenes where she realizes that, she's the oldest person in the office and they're trying to get rid of her, it's a more exaggerated version, I guess, of what I went through. And I wanted her to have a triumphant second act, and I really wanted her to, I tell you what, the scene that I really enjoyed writing, right at the end, when she gets the email from her editor saying, you know, could they possibly collaborate? And, and she tells him to F off. And you know, I had a lot of fun sort of writing that, and I was like, go girl, you know.
Excellent. Yes, that definitely brought a chuckle to me as well when I read that. And it's nice to get that little bit of revenge. So that's great. Another question that came in is this book covers a lot of territory and modern topics, and you touched on it with the social media. So we got same-sex marriage, bullying in school, men controlling women, racism. Did you set out to include all of those issues when you started writing the book, or did they just sort of come as you were writing? Like, was that something when you set out your plan? I don't know if you set up a plan when you wrote this book and had a sort of a beginning, a middle, and end, and how it was going to go, or did it just sort of evolve as you were writing? But had you sort of planned to touch on these topics?
I mean, I think it did sort of evolve. I mean, I started off. I mean, really where I started with the Iona character in my head. She was my sort of, you know, my jumping off point, if you like. And then I sort of thought, well, who else would you find on this train? And then, you know, once I decided what sort of characters you would find on the train, you then sort of think, well, what are those people struggling with? Because, you know, I love writing flawed characters. I worked out that actually what I'm most interested in isn't what people's strengths are, it's what people's weaknesses are. So when I start writing a character, I always sort of ask myself, you know, what do they find really difficult? What do they most want to change about themselves? What are they struggling with? Because I think those are the things that make us real and make us human and make us interesting. You know, it's not people's strengths. You know, so if you go back to Jane Austen, say, you know, I used to love Emma far more than you know, any of the other Austen books, because Emma was such a wonderfully flawed character. So once I got the characters, then you sort of work out, well, what are their flaws? What are they struggling with? What are their problems? And that, I guess, then leads you to, as you say, a number of those issues. So I didn't go in thinking I'm going to write about coercive control, say. I just went in thinking, here's my character, what she's struggling with, and that theme ended up sort of coming into it. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely it does. Oh, that's great. So another question, and again, sort of on the whole social media and connecting with younger ones. Iona has great pride in her abilities, but these were definitely being eroded. One funny scene is when Emmy tells Iona that her advice to the woman whose son watches porn online is totally outdated. Did some scenes come from your own life? And when you're writing this, like, is that something like maybe you said you got teenage children. I've got a teen, well, they're in their 20s now, but a boy and a girl. And that was something we sort of had to deal with my son when he was getting to that age. So I just wondered if it was something that came through and it was an experience that you had to deal with in your household as well.
Yes. I mean, a lot of, there are a number of things in the book that come from my own experience. That particular scene didn't, but I do constantly end up having those conversations with my kids where you know, they sort of you know, we end up sort of, you know, realizing that we are very much two different generations. So I do love playing with that whole sort of you know, misunderstandings between the generations. So, you know, that whole thing about pubic hair, for instance, you know, is a very much a different sort of different generation thing, you know. So yes, I mean, a number of instances in the book come from stuff that's happened to me, but not that particular one.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And now all of these things are very humorous that you've written into the book. So when you started out writing the book, did you want it to be a drama, or did you sort of maybe think it was going to be a bit more of a comedy? I mean, you meshed it beautifully together, the seriousness and the comedic in the book. But did you, again, set out to write either one or the other, or did it just, I mean, you've got a very funny sense of humor, and it's amazing how not many writers can get that humor across on page, and you've just done it brilliantly. So I was just wondering if that was something you're just had planned to sort of add the comedy in there.
Oh, thank you. No, actually, I mean, it's the only way I can write, because it really came from when I started writing my memoir. So, you know, going back again to when I first quit drinking, I started this blog called Mummy Was a Secret Drinker. And, you know, I was in a really bad place back then. You know, I was really, it's quite difficult to, you know, the first few months of going sober if you had a, you know, bad addiction. And you know, I was really struggling, and I found that for me the best way of dealing with it was to write and to laugh. So I started writing, you know, I wrote every day, but I wrote about what I was going through with, you know, a real sense of humor. And in fact, my publishers have described my memoir as Bridget Jones Dries Out. And they call it a dark comedy. But that's just my way of dealing with bad stuff, you know. And actually, sort of 8 months after I quit drinking, I got breast cancer, which I also cover in my memoir. And again, my way of dealing with breast cancer was, as much as possible, to find the, you know, light moments of humor in what I was going through. So I guess, you know, to answer your question, I just developed a writing style which was about dealing with tough stuff, but in a way that made it palatable, you know, and made it wherever possible humorous, you know, while still sort of, you know, while not belittling the things that people are going through. And that just became, I think, because I started with nonfiction, that just became my style. And I don't know how to write any other way now.
Well, you do it brilliantly, so please don't change it up, because it's like I said, this book has brought a lot of joy to a lot of readers. So another subject you sort of touch on is ignoring boundaries, the serious and the comedic. But have you ever struggled with establishing your own boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that, you know, when I started writing this blog, I did it anonymously, and I did it anonymously because I was so ashamed of the situation that I was in. And because it was anonymous, I felt able to just splurge all my you know, innermost thoughts and deepest, darkest secrets, which I never would have done if I'd been using my actual name. And of course, now, you know, I then sort of published the memoir, and it's now, and when I did that, I came out and told people what my real name was. And now, of course, all of that stuff is there. It's all on the internet, all of my sort of deepest, darkest secrets, and everyone knows it's me. So, you know, I totally overstepped my own boundaries. But in a way, and I was terrified before my memoir was published, you know, for the 3 nights beforehand, I had this terrible recurring nightmare where I don't know if you ever had this particular nightmare where you're walking down a street where everybody is fully clothed and you're completely naked. And I think the reason I had that dream is because that's how it felt, you know, publishing that book with all of the awful things that I'd done and felt, and sort of, you know, felt like walking down a street naked. But, you know, what was incredible about it is when you make yourself really vulnerable, people are actually really kind. You know, I expected to get terribly trolled, and I thought people would be really awful about, you know, about some of the things I'd done and said and thought, and people were really, really, on the whole, you know, apart from a few randoms, you know, people were really, really kind. And I sort of discovered that once you've been really honest about your life, there isn't really anything for anyone to beat you around the head about, because I'd already confessed to all of it anyway. You know, there was no point in people saying, oh, you were a terrible lush, because I sort of said, yeah, I know that, you know, or you were, you know, not a brilliant mother, you know, I knew that too, you know, so yeah, so it was very liberating.
Good. Now, this was a question that came in, and I thought when I read this question that got submitted, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. So, did you plan that chapter 58 will be the one where Iona is reborn, transitioned into her second act, since she had just turned 58?
You know what? That is extraordinary, because I never knew that. So no, I absolutely didn't, and I'm thrilled that you told me that.
Well, like I
That's
said, it was one of the questions that got submitted, and I went back and read chapter 58, and I'm like, oh my God, that is utterly brilliant. So anyway, so it wasn't intended.
So thank you so much for that piece of information, because now I'm going to tell everyone that it was absolutely deliberate.
Oh my gosh. Now, going back to a bit of on the writing side of things, did your time in advertising influence your writing at all? Like, have you pulled in on your days in advertising into the writing style? I know we talked about writing in humor, like humor and no boundaries and all that stuff, but did you ever pull on that, or was it like a clean slate after you left advertising, you took the writing course, and or have you used any of your previous work experience in advertising?
I think it has influenced the way that I write, in that when you're creating advertising, everything has to be really pared down. You know, you have, you know, the longest medium you work with is like 60 seconds normally. So you have to tell a story in a really succinct way. You can't use extraneous words ever. And I think that has influenced the way that I write, because, you know, I write very short chapters. I don't have long sections of prose. You know, I don't do long descriptive passages. You know, I like to get to the point quite quickly, and I have a quite, again, I think because I spent so much time in advertising, I have a very short attention span myself. So, you know, I really like short chapters. I like being able to just, you know, to read a book in bite-sized chunks. So yes, I think it has affected my style of writing, you know, which is obviously a lot longer than an advertisement, but is probably a lot pithier than many novels.
No, well, I think it's great. I mean, I read a lot, and I love the shorter segments of, you know, of chapters, and the succinctness of the chapters you wrote. So again, brilliant, great style. Don't change it. On page 127, Iona remembers B saying, "What is the point of being alive if you go through life unnoticed?" Is that something you personally take to heart?
Yeah, I think for me, it was a bit of a rallying call for myself. I mean, actually, quite a lot of what Iona says is you know, things I like to remind myself of, if you see what I mean. And you know, I think it's very easy, as particularly as a slightly older woman, to end up feeling invisible, and to you know, and then to not put yourself out there, because you just yeah, it feels a bit scary sometimes. And you know, and I do think it's important that we carry on making sure we're noticed and that we're heard, and you know, we have an awful lot to say, I think. You know, so yeah, so absolutely.
Right. So another, I love the way the characters all began helping each other rather than Iona single-handedly fixing everyone's problems. Why did you make that decision?
I'm really fascinated in sort of the way that communities can come together, and that and I'm particularly interested in multi-generational communities. So you know, what I'm really interested in is how, if you get a group of strangers who are all, you know, different ages, different backgrounds, different sexualities, you know, you name it, that they can all learn from each other. Because I think when we surround ourselves by people who are just like us, you just don't learn as much as you do when you're surrounded by people who are very different from you. And that's what I really wanted to explore, is how Piers and Martha could help each other, for instance, and how David could then help Iona, and it's sort of, I just wanted to put across the idea that we all have something that we can offer somebody, even if you don't think that you do, you absolutely do. There will be somebody who can really benefit from your experience and your wisdom.
Excellent. Now, are you part of a community like that? Are you involved, like maybe when you did your writing group that might have had a bunch of diverse participants, or are you part of a community within your own community where you live in London that is like that?
Actually, part of the reason I wanted to explore that whole idea through writing is because I realized that actually, so most of the people I saw most of the time were just like me. It was other mothers at the school gate, it was other people in advertising, it's other people sort of, in the exact area I live in, and I felt like I sort of, I was living in this bubble. And even on social media, you end up following people who are just like you, and you end up in an echo chamber. It's funny you mentioned the writing group, because when I started doing this, so I did a 3-month novel writing course, and I looked around the room and I realized it was the first time in a very long time that I'd sat in a room surrounded by completely diverse people. So the ages in that, there were 15 of us, and the youngest woman was 23, and the oldest was a man who was like in his mid-60s, I think. And we had, we were completely different ages. We were sort of had completely different backgrounds. We different. We had almost nothing in common, all of us, apart from the fact that we all wanted to write a novel of some description, and the novels we wanted to write were totally different too. So and that group, we're all still in contact, and we meet up sort of on Zoom and in person, sort of on a regular basis. And I love that, the fact that we are so very different.
Wonderful. It is. It's nice. There's so many communities out there, and it's just a matter of making yourself open to those various different communities. So
and book groups can very, book clubs can be, a real conduit for that, I think.
Absolutely. And again, another one, many characters actually needed to ask for help before they can heal. So Sanji and Emmy in particular. Why was it important for that part of the story to come through? Asking for help.
I guess it comes back to the theme in a way of, people, the people in London sort of never engaging with strangers on public transport. I think the British particularly are very bad at letting their guards down, and we there's the stiff upper lip is probably not as prevalent as it used to be, but it's still there. We still like everybody to to believe that our lives are perfect. And actually with my previous novel, The Authenticity Project, the theme that I explored through that was the fact that we all tend to lie about our lives, if not overtly, then just in the way that we sort of portray these seemingly perfect sort of lives on social media, etc., when the reality is we're all struggling with something. And the truth is that if you tell people that you're struggling, if you ask for help, then then not only does it make you feel better, but it makes them feel better, because they realize that they're not the only person struggling. So, if we all portray these perfect lives, we all make each other feel awful because everybody feels inadequate. So in asking for help, you're not just doing yourself a favor. You're doing a favor for the people around you.
So a segue into that, I know you said you used to commute. You know, the first rule of commuting is never talk to strangers. Since writing Iona, have you turned over a new leaf, and do you just talk to strangers? Like if you were to get on the double-decker bus and someone was to sit next to you, do you greet them now, or do you still just keep to yourself?
You know what? I wish I could tell you that having written this book, I now talk to strangers on public transport, but I don't. What I do is think what I would say if I were to. The only time I talk to strangers on public transport is when every now and again I see somebody reading one of my books. And then I go and say, oh yeah, you're reading one of my books. And actually I had the funniest experience the other day when I was on an aeroplane and I saw this woman reading my book. You know, she was reading The Authenticity Project. And I went up to her and I was on my way to the loo, and I spotted her reading and I stopped and I said, excuse me, I said, I'm really sorry to bother you, but you're reading my book. And she said, no, I'm not. I bought it at the airport.
She didn't make the connection at all.
No, but I mean, I wrote it, not
Oh, now another question with regards to characters. Once your characters are out in the reading world, do you ever think about revisiting them in another book, or are they done in your mind? I mean, I'll bring up Elizabeth Strout, like she does Lucy, and she's had Olive Kitteridge, and she's done 6 books now around the same characters. You know, that's one way of doing it. I know a number of people come back into the store and said to me, well, it's going to be the last Elizabeth Strout I'm reading. I'm sick and tired of the characters, but I'm just curious to know whether or not, like, you feel there's more stories to be told within the characters, or are you completely done with Iona and Piers and Martha and Sanjay?
You know what? It's really tricky because I would love to write about them more, and the characters from the Authenticity Project as well, who I'm still very fond of. But I'm really nervous about doing it because I just find from a personal perspective that so often when I read a sequel, or you know, when I watch a sequel on TV or in film, it just doesn't live up to the original. And I think often what happens is when people get to the end of one of my books, they imagine what's going to happen next. I certainly do. You know, I sort of think, you know, I wonder what Iona is doing now, and I wonder what happened to B, and I wonder. And you write the story to an extent yourself, you know, and then if you read a sequel that isn't what you were expecting or isn't what you were hoping, it can be a real disappointment. And I just don't want to write something that leaves people feeling let down in any way. So I guess to answer your question, I'm too scared to do it. And I wouldn't do it unless I knew I could do it really, really well. Yeah.
Understand. Well, I know, again, a lot of the comments that came in is many readers say they plan to read this book again because they just loved Iona. And I know I've read it twice now, and it'll be one I will read again. So, you know, because they're just such fond characters. So on that note, we did another Islington Reads, and the book we talked with the author, her name's Leslie Crew, was called The Spoon Stealer. Is it a book that you've ever heard of? Because there's some similarities about it. It's about an older woman wanting to write a memoir class, takes a memoir writing class. She's lesbian, and it's just about finding your own voice at an older age. So anyway, if you don't have it, I will send you a copy. I'll get your address from Emma, and I'll send you a copy in the mail. But it was one someone just asked if you had read that, because she felt that, you know, she just loved the 2 books equally. So there we go.
No, I'd love to read that. That sounds right up my alley.
So it is. It's absolutely, yeah, it's a fun book. So now I guess the only other question that came in was about theater. So live theater seems to come up. I mean, B and Iona, and then Martha taking on auditions and everything else. Is that something you love? Do you feel live theater is important? Like it's sort of played throughout the book.
I love the theatre. I think there's something really special about the theatre, and I'm very lucky living in London, and we have incredible theatre, and it's one of the things I miss. I don't think I realised how much I loved it until the pandemic, when all the theatres closed, and I really, really missed it. So I think it often comes in just because it's something that I'm passionate about myself. It just weaves its way into the story often. And actually the new story I'm writing now also involves a sort of theatrical element. So yeah, it is something I'm very passionate about. I think there's something, it's a very different form of storytelling, but I think what's lovely about the theatre is the way that you experience the story along with a live audience. So, you know, whereas when you're reading a novel, it's just you and the novel. It's a very personal one-on-one thing. Whereas a theatre is, you know, you're experiencing the same thing with a whole group of other people, and it makes it a very different experience.
There we go. Now, on that note, has Iona Iverson be picked up to be made into a movie? Is it something you would ever consider selling the rights to have a movie made out of your book?
I would love it to be a movie, but it hasn't yet. I can tell you exactly who I'd want to play Iona as well.
Who would that be?
Emma Thompson.
Okay.
Who is actually exactly the right age for Iona, and she's got the right attitude, and she's got the right sort of, you know, chutzpah. You know, she would, I think she would be great. So that's you know, maybe one day.
There you go. That would be brilliant. So anyway, like I said, the characters are going to live along in my world for a long time. So we're getting close to the finish of the hour. So I just wanted to say thank you. And I just want to say, I know there's a lot of people out there, they're going to, when they're walking around, they see something, they're going to say in their head, what would Iona do? And we are just so glad you brought Iona to life and shared Iona with all of us. And yes, we'll all try to take a page out of her book and be more like Iona. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. And thank you for writing such an absolutely brilliant novel. And we will look forward to the one you've alluded to. So anyway, thank you very, very much. And I'm going to pass it over to Maya. I think she's going to say a couple of words. But one other thing I do have to say is we have set the date for our next Islington Reads, and that is going to be on Tuesday, April the 18th. And the book we're going to be doing is At Last Count by Clare Dunn. So it again, it is a fun book. It looks at OCD. It looks at a young lady whose apartment building is being torn down, and she needs to move out in 8 days. And she goes back to her family home and has to revisit a whole bunch of her past and her memories. So that's what we've got for our next Islington Reads in April. So now, again, thank you very much, Claire, for a wonderful evening in your time, and you know, really, really appreciate it. And now over to Maya.
Claire, we want to just bless you into the next writing project that's alive in your heart and on your computer. We want to give thanks for the ways that your characters have touched our hearts and our lives to start this year. And I think the blessing for all of us is to find courage and bravery to build community wherever we are, and to be a light to a stranger who may become a friend. So thanks for inspiring us to do that, and bless you in your work. And we're grateful to hold your work in our hands as we read, but in our hearts as we go. Thanks so much for your time.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a really, really lovely session. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
That's our privilege. Take care. Good night.
Thank
For
you.
the rest of us, we look forward to April together. And if you'd like to stay on for some conversation, we can do that, and keep checking in with Sarah to see what else she's got up her sleeve for all of us as we read through this year together. Bye, Claire. Thanks, everybody. Take care.